You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio. Welcome to the Bitter Medicine Podcast, where it's all about Black empowerment. Our show focuses on Black news and entertainment, arts, science, economics, history, people, and strategies that uplift, empower, and motivate Africans within the diaspora. And now, your host, whose favorite color is black, Goku.
Welcome back to the Bitter Medicine Podcast. I am your host, Koku. Glad to be back today. We are going to read this paper. Before we read the paper, I want to remind you guys that this show is a part of a podcast network called KWAZ Radio. You guys should be tuning in to other shows on the network, in particular.
This is DAX. You tune into the Harsh Reality Podcast, providing you with social commentary on the news affecting our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-Black perspective, where Black problems are addressed with Black solutions.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
And of course, check out the Queen's Council podcast, also on KWAZ Radio. So, I see NYC Beauties is in the chat room already. Peace to NYC Beauties. Peace to everyone who's tuned in tonight. Without further ado, let's get into this paper. Where is it? Hold on. Okay, there it is. So this paper is called The Truth About the Mau Mau Movement, the Most Popular Uprising in Kenya. It is written by Mwangi Wa-Githumo back in 1989. The abstract reads, between World War I and World War II, they developed deep sentiment within the ranks of some of the Kenya's proto-nationalists that the political, economic, and educational aspirations of the people of Kenya could never be realized short of organized armed action. Between 1946 and 1952, this sentiment was translated into the creation of a movement, which later came to be known as the Mau Mau. The history of the Mau Mau movement is therefore inextricably the history of the struggle for the return of all lands that have been expropriated from Kenya's agrarian and pastoral communities at gunpoint by European empire builders, commercial companies, and settlers. It was the first revolt in colonial Kenya to seek workers and peasants' support in an organized manner. Right? In an organized manner. The popular view of the meaning of the Mau Mau movement was reinforced in its early stages by a series of political and religious awakenings through oath-taking, as well as patriotic songs, which the colonial authorities characterized as seditious. The Mau Mau freedom fighters' attitudes toward Britain's incursion and vampirism in Kenya, as well as her draconian land ordinance, further contributed to the idiosyncratic nature of the Mau Mau movement. These freedom fighters believed, and many shared their beliefs, that the colonial land and labor policies and the accompanying legislations were despicably riddled with hypocrisy, regression, and bigotry. The purpose of this article is to provide a brief but incisive picture of the Mau Mau movement. The article is not a historical treatise on the movement, but it does direct attention to that history by emphasizing political, economic, and social concerns of the past. Let's check in the chat room. Seems like I'm being heard. That's good. Okay, let's get into it. Those who oppress do not respond to petitions, demonstrations, and the demands of the oppressed. That's how you start a piece of writing. Just straight in your face. Those who oppress do not respond to petitions. They don't respond to change.org. They don't respond to your demonstrations, walking in circles. Right? That's just the reality of it. The oppressor murders at his leisure and does not cease until the oppressed, recognizing that the oppressor has no right to oppress, assert their right to live by using the only language the oppressor has ever used, and the only language that he understands. The sound of gunfire, the sound of dynamite, the sound of his own death in his ear. This was a quote by Julius Lester, 1970, in what's called the Revolutionary Notes. That's a great quote. Although it is not intended to trace the entire history of the Mau Mau uprising, or to tell its full nature in any detail here, a few facts should be noted about this movement, for it will help our understanding of some of the aspects of African nationalism, as well as the politics of land in Kenya. It must also be realized that Kenya was the only British colony in Africa whose economic and racial policies, as well as land question, paralleled those of Rhodesia and South Africa. It therefore occupies a significant position in the study of nationalist movements in Africa. The first of these facts is that, viewed from both unbiased and an appropriate angle, the most dynamic aspect of African nationalism in Kenya has been the Mau Mau uprising. It was a revolutionary and military response to the imperialist incursions, aggressions, land expropriation, as well as the exploitation of the Africans' natural and human resources. Although the movement did not reach its height until 1952, it had began long before it became an identifiable and cohesive movement. Not only did the movement grow out of land grievances as reflected by and articulated in persistent demands and militant agitation of the proto-nationalist organizations of the early 1920s, but the movement also reflected political realities which became more permanent in the struggle for political and economic independence in Kenya. This is one of the reasons why the movement resolutely challenged the propensity of the so-called white settlers who had persistently and stubbornly refused Africans to share with them the very best lands which they had expropriated and which belonged to Africans by right. Most important, the movement questioned the professed legal rights and justification which the British settlers used when they unilaterally declared Kenya in 1915 a white man's country, at least for 999 years, during which period no economic or political changes were to take place, especially if those changes were intended to improve the economic status or the lot of the black peoples of Kenya. One of the earliest and leading roles that the Mau Mau movement played in the struggle for Kenya's independence was to politicize and to mobilize the agrarian sectors in Kenya in order to shape their political awareness and economic thinking, and to set the stage for future national consciousness of the whole country. It was this consciousness which passionately stirred the peasants of Kenya out of decades of somnolence that was characterized by passivity and docility. It was this consciousness which stirred the peasants. Not only was this awakening vital and inevitable, but it also helped in the long run to stimulate a growing and militant sense of human dignity in one's land, hitherto experienced in colonial Kenya. Thanks to the courageous Mau Mau freedom fighters who exerted with a balanced virtuosity the deepest intensity of conscious influence among the rural population, especially in the Central and the Rift Valley provinces, those making an uprising inevitable. It is also true that the Mau Mau movement was the logical and most observable peak of the agrarian nationalist sentiments, whose political and economic grievances had their roots in the land question that goes back to the 1890s. Analytically, when compared with other nationalist movements that affect Kenya in the colonial period, the Mau Mau movement was the most revolutionary, sophisticated, and the most effective nationalist movement ever launched in Kenya, against British colonialism in general and land expropriation in particular between 1952 and 1956. Equally important, it was the most dynamic movement that successfully dismantled the repressive feudal-like colonial policies that had guided Kenya throughout its years of colonial disaster, thus disintegrating the settler-dominated Slavocratic system of economy and government, both of which unalterably embraced the colonial land policies. The Mau Mau Revolt was part of a fabric of audacious action which caused the brain of the adamant and entrenched European settlers to reel. The movement provided maximum political leverage to the united Mau Mau freedom fighters. Unquestionably, the Mau Mau uprising of the 1950s marked the highest point of the nationalist temper and potential of the black man's revolutionary struggle for his lost land. The uprising was an explosion that came about after a long process of subjugation and ruthless exploitation of Kenya's human and natural resources by European imperialists. It should also be emphasized at this juncture that no preparation for eventual independence for Kenya had ever been made by the British government before the Mau Mau rebellion. Consequently, for those of us who looked to radical nationalist movement as the hope for the future of Kenya, the Mau Mau revolution marked not only a turning point in Kenya's political history, but also the most important period for celebration. The movement was also a conscionable call upon the British government, the colonial administration, as well as the recalcitrant European settlers in Kenya, who were themselves guilty of excessive voraciousness and of an egregious abuse of African land rights, to correct their racist and prejudiced attitudes towards the African peoples and owners of the land that they were unconscionably prostituting, and at the same time to heed the cry of the unjustly assaulted and deprived peasants. The basic character of the Mau nationalists was that they were from the beginning imbued with the idea of wiping out colonial rule from Kenya roots and branches. The Mau Mau nationalists themselves were fundamentally consciously connected with the ongoing agrarian efforts of the 1890s through 1930s to cast off the settlers' economic and political domination in order to take charge of their own land, as well as of other political and economic affairs. One of the most notable contributions of the Mau Mau movement to the overall nationalist sentiments was that it stirred the slumbering parts of Kenya into uncontrollable fires and flames of national consciousness. The Mau Mau freedom fighters pursued their struggles for the stolen lands in a manner that was commensurate with the entire framework of the people's needs, the needs which were purely broad-based upon the people's expectation and will. The modern Mau Mau freedom fighters and the concept of land rights were the fundamental and ideological guide as well as inspirer of the Mau Mau movement itself. The Mau Mau freedom fighters were also imbued with a revolutionary commitment and vehemence, which made them willing to sacrifice their lives in the cause of land or death. All right? Where is that sentiment today? Where is the land or death sentiment today? Right? Objectively, the Mau Mau movement was the most articulate public spokesman for African peasants yearning for the restoration of their forcibly and illegally obliterated land rights. In truth, before the Mau Mau freedom fighters registered their grievance, this yearning seemed a dim and distant reality in a country where economic, political, and judicial powers were in the hands of the white minority, and where the majority of the black peoples remained at the mercy of the white man's claws and teeth. Given the greed and the appetite of the white settlers, the Mau Mau freedom fighters knew that the white man was not in a position to hand the lost land back to the black peoples of Kenya on a platter. The success of the Mau Mau movement in politicizing, mobilizing, and revolutionizing the rural masses in Kikuyu, as well as its armed victories over the British troops and their African puppets, had a profound psychological effect on Kenya as a whole, despite settlers' efforts to characterize the movement as a purely Kikuyu agitation. All right. Let me just check something real quick. Boom, boom, boom. So the Kikuyu are a Bantu ethnic group native to central Kenya, but also found in significantly less numbers in Tanzania, right? So when they refer to Kikuyu, that's what they're talking about. So they're trying to say it was just a particular group, right? A particular group that was causing the problem, not the whole of Kenya. The distortion and misinterpretation of the authentic aims of the Mau Mau movement in Kenya stem primarily from the lack of understanding, hypocrisy, and racial biases on the part of the Europeans about the changes which were taking place in East Africa, especially during the period following World War II. The growth of nationalist movements in Kenya was regarded by most European settlers as an expression of deviant behavior, something that could never lead to any political equality between Africans and Europeans. As for an example, commenting on Kikuyu nationalism in Kenya, two Western writers, namely E. Stillman and W. Pfaff, have described the Mau Mau movement and the entire Kikuyu nationalist movement as a non-political phenomenon, characterized by terrible atavism and barbarity, and as a savage revenge which sought escape in a pathological violence that had no real objective. Pot calling kettle, huh? Where am I? As J.C. McLean rightly observes, dispatches from Nairobi during the Mau Mau movement stated that European settlers refused to place much weight on economic motives, quote, preferring to characterize Mau Mau as an atavistic phenomenon, yet Africans could list a number of Kikuyu grievances, political, economic, and land hunger, without compensating opportunities and instances where the white community had successfully interceded with the colonial office to retard African political representation. The truth about the Mau Mau movement was that in addition to fighting for land and freedom, and against other forces that embrace exploitative capitalist inherent ideology, the movement served as a voice who spoke loud and clear for immediate national independence that was to be followed by full economic liberty and full rights for constructive political participation, without first making political or economic accommodation with the oppressive British imperialists. The most disturbing and equally inescapable fact, which most biased Western writers who have written about the Mau Mau movement appear to have been unable to see or to admit, is that the economic frustrations and the brutalization of the political organizations of Black Africans in Kenya were the work of the colonial administration itself that significantly precipitated the upheavals of the colonial era. Evidently, it was their short-sightedness and biased attitudes towards Black peoples, as well as toward their nationalist movements, which prevented some of the Western writers, such as Edmund Stillman and William Pfaff, or Pfaff, I guess, from seeing that it was the unsympathetic European settlers with their discriminatory economic and political policies and racist institutions who had created and perpetuated subhuman conditions under which the Black man was forced to serve the white man. For one to characterize the African struggle against colonialism as terrible atavism, and at the same time to rationalize the oppressive and equally racist behavior of the white settler, is not only incredible, but is also nothing short of monstrous. Stillman and Pfaff and those who share their arguments and beliefs would have been accurate had they been able to observe that the behavior of the white settlers had undoubtedly created a breeding ground for the Mau Mau movement, and that it was the white community in Kenya that was responsible for the racial and economic pathology of colonial Kenya. Specifically, land robbery and forced labor in Kenya between 1901 and 1939 produced a nationalist independence movement that nourished the spirit of the nationalist groups all over Kenya. Because of this spirit, the Mau Mau freedom fighters and their sympathizers were not only hated by most Europeans, but they were also projected as irresponsible terrorist guerrillas without genuine support from the masses. This was a wrong and biased projection. While the avowed purpose of the Mau Mau movement was to secure the return of the stolen lands, the British used their deadly and sophisticated guns and bombs, you see, to suppress the movement, charging that the Mau Mau revolt was characterized by pathological violence that had no identifiable objectives or grievances. You know, we see this game run all the time, you know. There's nothing new here. This is the deceit, right, that these guys run. They're never the problem causers. They just have to respond to the problems, and of course they have to respond to the problems with brute force, right? And this is the game that's being played, and too many of our folks in particular are not paying attention to it. We don't expect nothing from their folks, right? If their folks even realize that their folks aren't even going to speak up, you know, the truth to it, right? We have to do that, and not to speak up on this truth and constantly, you know, shout it towards these other folks who are doing the foolishness. They know what they're doing, right? We have to internalize it and get organized like the Mau Mau eventually does, right? We have to stop the oppression. The oppressed don't stop it. It's the oppressed, right? The oppressor doesn't stop it, it's the oppressor who does. On the contrary, the Mau Mau movement had bold, clear, and decisive objectives of high order and vision. In reality, it was the white settlers under the umbrella of the British troops and imported police dogs from South Africa who resorted to unprecedented killings of innocent people while at the same time using the press, radio, and biased films to discredit the Mau Mau freedom fighters. Right? So what are we talking about here? Propaganda, right? This is why we have to engage in our own propaganda, right? To deceive the world and to cover their unwarranted, barbarous, and iniquitous actions against the black peoples of Kenya. Writing on the specter of Mau Mau, R. Paid Pankhurst sharply argued, quote, for some time past, the settlers had been focusing attention on Mau Mau outrages and urging the need for strong measures to combat the crime wave, though in fact no great increase in violence had been recorded and crimes of violence were as yet scarcely more common in Kenya than in nearby Tanganyika and Uganda. The European settlers, however, paid great attention to such incidents as occurred, for the Mau Mau movement was pledged to drive the white man out of Africa. The settler press gave great publicity to the outrages, killing of cattle, etc., and described them in detail, thereby conjuring up the specter of Mau Mau. With the declaration of state emergency throughout Kenya in 1952, the settler-dominated press and radio network remained virtually the only medium for informing the world of what was going on in Kenya during the next 8 years, and for keeping up with the development of the fight between the Mau Mau freedom fighters and the British troops that were backed by the NATO forces. This is why I don't understand why folks put so much faith in NATO. Right? Why are folks putting so, like, can someone express, you know, can someone give me the answer to that? Why is so much you know, why is so much put on this notion that NATO is like this neutral party all the time? right? By the way, if I'm not mistaken, if there was someone here to fact check it, if I'm not mistaken, I think Kenya was an early choice. Now, think about this for a second. I think Kenya was an early choice to be where they put the the Uish, right? If I'm not mistaken, someone let me know. I'm pretty sure in the early 1900s, Kenya was the proposed site as a safe haven for the Jews. And if I remember correctly, they en masse kind of refused it because it was too hot or something like that, right? You can't take the heat, right? But I mean, think about that. These Herzl and these guys can choose an African country and say, yeah, this is the country, right? It wasn't Uganda. I'm almost certain it was Kenya. This is the country. We're going to land our Uish people, and this will be their homeland. Imagine that. Once you think that through, then you'll understand what power is and what power is needed for our folks, man. To continue, it should also be remembered that the real political power in colonial Kenya was always held by the power giddy, Nairobi-based white settlers, with the London-based British government serving as a benign co-conspirator of Africans' economic and political rights. Not only were these settlers favored by the press, but they also enjoyed strong backing among the intransigent South African and Rhodesian settlers, as well as among the British land speculators and business tycoons in London and Pretoria. Contrary to the wrong and biased impression and distortion by the colonial government about the Mau Mau movement, it is as significant for the adherents of truth as it is painfully unavoidable to bear in mind that the confrontation between Great Britain and the Mau Mau freedom fighters was the result of deteriorating political and economic relationships between European settlers and African peasants, accentuated by the persistence of European feudal-like landlordism and economic racism in colonial Kenya. Consequently, it is highly desirable that the facts about violence during struggle against foreign incursions and aggressors be clearly spelt out and understood. The author does not deny that the Mau Mau freedom fighters also used violence in their campaign against the British troops. His argument is that the Mau Mau freedom fighters had no recourse but to use defensive violence when confronted by the well-armed British soldiers who did not speak or understand any other language other than that of violence and shooting at the first glimpse. Admittedly, it was very difficult to deal with European settlers or British troops non-violently, especially between 1952 and 1956. You know me, I have a problem with writing like that. It's kind of limp-wristed writing to me, kind of extremely passive, like you're almost apologizing for retaliating. I don't share in that sentiment. It is absurd to claim, as some writers have done, that it was the Mau Mau terrorists who committed outrageous, violent crimes while the settlers, the colonial army and police, as well as the British troops, used peaceful and civilized means to restore peace, law, and order in Kenya. The author, who was himself one of the victims of the British violence, observed between 1952 and 1956 that violence had become so much a way of life in Kenya that the white man could still shoot a black man who approached him non-violently or on his knees with his hands up in order to turn the other cheek to be hit. Imagine that. As so it was on the continent, so it was in America. It was during this time when the author came to realize how stupid it is for one to turn his cheek politely and passively to someone who does not believe in the teachings of the Bible and who does not share his religious beliefs. For such an infidel of person will, without paying attention to the biblical teachings, violently and deliberately land a crushing and merciless blow in your face. At that right there, I could get behind. The author learned from first-hand experience how dumb it is to talk about turning the other cheek. With folks who clearly don't believe in what it is they pushed on you, right? Folks clearly don't believe in what they pushed on you. So they're smashing your face to pieces. They don't care. They don't care about smashing your face to pieces. They don't believe in what they've pushed on you. Meanwhile, you believe in hook, line, and sinker. Commenting on violence and the distortion of the Mau Mau movement, Mwangi Wa-Githumo has eloquently argued that violence in order to change an intolerable, unjust social order is not savagery. It purifies man. But violence to protect and preserve an unjust, oppressive social order, Mwangi further argues, is criminal and diminishes man. Hold on a second. Okay, now I understand. So yeah. So the man who's trying to oppress you and is using violence, he's a diminished man. The man who's trying to protect himself from being oppressed, he's a purified man. And that's a good concept to carry forward in your personal lives, right? The purified man versus the diminished one, right? You want to be a purified man. Disagreeing with and accusing Fred Majdalani, the author of A State of Emergency, The Full Story of Mau Mau, of having both failed and doggedly refused to tell the full story of several crucial incidents that took place during the Mau Mau movement, Mwangi rightly concludes that Mau Mau violence was anti-injustice, white violence was to thwart the cause of justice. Moreover, there are situations in which great and cancerous social injustices can be cured only by the quote-unquote surgery of armed force. There are situations in which great and cancerous social injustices can be cured only by the quote-unquote surgery of armed forces. In our aversion to violence, W. Stanley succinctly reminds us we must not forget either that war, in some instances, is the only alternative to slavery, or that the right of revolt against an undemocratic and oppressive social order supported by an arbitrary government is a fundamental tenet of the democratic tradition. Consequently, no one will deny the fact that it was the uncompromising revolutionary armed forces of African freedom fighters that enabled Guinea-Bissau, Angola, and Mozambique to successfully carry on an unfaltering campaign against European imperialists and finally to defeat the virulent Portuguese imperialist forces. Fortunately, what has not been so generally recognized is that because of lack of economic compassion and political sensitivity, some European settlers suggested a scorched earth policy during the Mau Mau War in order to exacerbate the bitterness and terror of their departure. That's absolutely true, right? That's absolutely true. How could any European who professed to be civilized, so considerate in dealing with so-called uncivilized Africans, seemingly lack such compassion and sensitivity to the winds of change that were blowing in East Africa? The unrealistic and equally biased attitudes of the European community in Kenya during the colonial days amply demonstrated the existence of grave dangers to the people. Hence, the struggle for political self-determination had become inevitable. Another reason why the aims of the Mau Mau movement were distorted by the colonial government was that these aims represented a clear threat to the settlers' freehold titles of land and other property rights. For example, under the Crown Lands Ordinance of 1915, all the bona fide capitalist settlers in Kenya were unalterably to enjoy these rights for 999 years. Look at that, right? Under the Crown Lands Ordinance of 1915, all the bona fide capitalist settlers in Kenya were unalterably to enjoy these rights for 999 years. So this goes back. So two things. This goes back to the to the first sentiment. This goes back to the first sentiment of these white folks referring to Kenya as a white man's country for 1,000 years. So this was backed by the whole Crown Lands thing. I'm from a place that used to have Crown Land. My grandmother had Crown Land. Crown Land was something that was given like for 30 years or something, then you had to re-up on it. And you could never own the land, really. Maybe some of it, I can't remember that part. But you could never really own the land, all right? You could lease it for like 30 years and you had to pay a fee for the land, etc. Right? But you could farm the land, you could make money off the land, etc. Right? These guys came in, again, power. These guys came in and declared, we have these crown lands for the next 1,000 years. I've seen the chat room, we got Thabo in the chat room. Thabo, I think this is 2 times in a row Thabo's been with us. Good to see you here. Thabo says the Zionist movement was offered Kenyan land as a temporary homeland by the colonial secretary, Joseph Chamberlain. Roads Less Traveled, German Jewish Exile Experiences in Kenya, 1933 to 1947. So I guess that's a book title that Thabo just hit us with at the end there. But yeah, I was pretty sure I was right. It was Kenya that was offered up to be the homeland. I don't remember it being temporary, but I know for sure there was offered Kenya or lands in Kenya to be there. And of course, these Uish are so feeble. The heat was too much for them, right? So they turned it down, for what I remember, right? Thanks for being here, Thabo. Thanks for that information. While the Mau Mau movement had become a committed struggle for the die-hard white settlers, the colonial and equally settler-dominated government refused to acknowledge the fact that much of the economic and racial distress and political disturbances affecting the country were by and large due to a settler policy of dehumanizing and humiliation, a policy which called for widespread political and economic changes. It is worthwhile to note that even the London Times, which had been one of the public spokesmen for European settlers in Kenya during the state of emergency, had to accept the truth when it eloquently acknowledged that the trouble in Kikuyu land must be, quote, must be regarded as a phase in the struggle of African nationalism to assert itself, a struggle which bore a distinctive character because it was the first time in a British African colony that such a movement had taken place on the very doorstep of European settlement. End of quote. Having ignored the principles of international law and natural justice, British government decided between 1952 and 1954 to act contrary to justice and common sense. As a result, British imperial troops continued to be flown in to reinforce the Kenya armed forces. There was indiscriminate arming of the settler population. Tracking dogs used to chasing Africans were imported from South Africa. The loyal Kikiyus were ordered to form home guard units for the defense of the settler systems. Wow. Despite all this, the Mau Mau movement eventually produced clandestine organizations to defend itself. Consequently, British repression rapidly unleashed a chain of events which set fire to the powder barrel. RKP Pan curse has described the episodes of British repression thus, quote, on the European side, power slid more firmly into the hands of the militant settlers, who were transformed overnight into an armed phalanx. Settlers' commandos were recruited. In the situation of panic thus produced, more than 500 settlers from all over Kenya gathered at Kalu to reiterate their traditional demand, quote, government of Kenya by Kenyans under European leadership, and a free hand without interference from overseas politicians. Imagine that. Government of Kenya by Kenyans under European leadership. On the African side, the wholesale arrests of moderate responsible leaders also produced panic and confusion, which necessarily placed policies of moderation and responsible action at a discount, whilst opening the field to any advocate of more drastic policies. End of quote. You know, it's tough to read that kind of stuff, man. It's tough to see the amount of distance you can give up if you're not careful, man. When you lose, honestly, anything can happen to you. I see Kevin Cares in the room, Kevin Care 42. It's in the chat room saying greetings to you too, brother. Thanks for being here. But yeah, that's a tough thing to consider. You know, you lose without realizing you're in a war. You lose, and to see how, you know, being in the loser's position, how much can be piled up on you, right? That's why you should never ever find yourself in a war that you didn't know you were in. Never find yourself in a war that you never knew you were in. If you're in a war and you don't know it, you're twice behind. I'm gonna pause here, take a quick commercial break, station ID break. I'll be back on the other side.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
This is DAX. You tune into the Harsh Reality Podcast, providing you with social commentary on the news affecting our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-black perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Also, check out the Queen's Council podcast, which is also here on KWAZ Radio. Let's continue with this paper. In order to cripple the Mau Mau movement, the declaration of the state of emergency in 1952 included the banning of all African political organizations and the arrest of the prominent nationalist leaders. Some of these leaders were later tried under concocted charges, after which they were convicted, jailed, and effectively silenced. All the African nationalist owners and editors of various progressive newspapers, such as Mumin Yeri, Muthamaki, etc., the majority of which were written in vernacular or local languages, were arrested, taken to detention camps, and their newspapers proscribed, thus muzzling Kenya's hitherto progressive and most widely read papers. So I have a question here. Earlier in this reading, we established that the Brits never interacted in any language but their own language. These newspapers were written in local language. How did the Brits know what was being said? Now, of course, the Brits could have interpreters, right? That's an easy fix. But do we think there's only interpreters who were giving them the information based on what we know of history? Although there had been indiscriminate mass arrests in the Kikuyu country between September 1952 and March 1953, it was in 1954 that these unwarranted arrests reached their highest peak. For example, in April 1954, under the so-called Operation Anvil, hundreds of thousands of male Kikuyu were arrested and taken to the concentration camps without explaining to them why they had been arrested or the crimes they were alleged to have committed. The only crime seemed to have been suspected of membership in or sympathy with the Mau Mau movement. The rising voice of protest was no longer a murmur of the Kikuyu community. It had become a countrywide outcry. The Kikuyu women in the rural areas seemed to feel sorrow rather than antagonism when they saw the police, the army, and the home guards treating their husbands, daughters, and sons like objects rather than decent human beings. Quote, "It is both sickening and terrible," end of quote, said one aggrieved woman of Ihiga, Ria Bimrari Ya Mwanika in July 1954. "But what can we do?" she asked. Most of the arrests which were made during these emergency operations had absolutely no justifiable reason or excuse for them. Some of these brutal arrests were accompanied by kidnappings, arson, torture of the kidnapped and illegally arrested persons, and forced confessions. Nevertheless, the Kikuyu rural population continued to support the Mau Mau movements under the belief that it was a revolution that belonged to the masses. The Operation Anvil of 1954 apparently aimed at depriving the Mau Mau freedom fighters in the forest and other hideouts of the moral, political, and material support that they were receiving from their compatriots and sympathizers living in the urban areas. The whole country was shocked at these repressive measures that went hand in hand with dastardly murders of innocent Africans. You see this? This being shocked by what the Europeans do, we got to stop that. You feel me? We have to stop this shock and awe that it seems we have in mass to what Europeans do. At this point of the game, even at this point that we're reading about in 1954, they shouldn't have been in no shock and awe. How foolish are we? We've lived through the history. Our ancestors have lived through, the stories have been passed down, and we're still in shock and awe? Come on. It makes no sense. Clearly, certainly these measures could only turn the victimized people against the white community in Kenya, as well as his African collaborators who had so embarrassingly and unconscionably betrayed their trust by joining foreign enemies. What the author terms to have been inexplicable and inexcusable was the manner in which the loyal and equally opportunistic Africans in the police and the army forces, some senior civil servants, the chiefs, and the rootless home guards ingenuously followed the orders and the footprints of their white masters, even when the question at issue was that of torturing or murdering their innocent black brothers and sisters. All right? Come on, man. I see NYC Sports Archives is here. Thanks for joining us. All right? To thwart the political aims of the Mau Mau movement, and in order to deflect people's attention from Mau Mau victories, the British government introduced in September 1952 a number of stringent emergency decrees which prohibited Africans from taking the Mau Mau patriotic oaths, aiding Mau Mau freedom fighters in any way, attending all African meetings except, of course, those sponsored by African stooges, participating in demonstrations, processions, or strikes, shouting pro-Mau Mau political slogans, singing nationalist songs, possessing or carrying firearms, or publishing and circulating literature which the white man regarded as likely to cause disturbances in the colony. Now, this section here is pretty neat, and it's not unique either. But again, we see all the parts of like revolution, right? Patriotic oaths, right? Helping the freedom fighters in any way you can, like going to meetings, you know, African organizations, right? You don't go to the meetings of stooges, right? Like you wouldn't go to a what's my man here in New York again, Al Sharpton. You wouldn't go to some shit like that, right? But real political organizations really doing the work, right? You know, there's some people who will participate in demonstrations. I'm cool on that personally. Processions or strikes, shouting pro-Mau Mau political slogans, singing nationalist songs. That's why you have the artists around too, right? They're the ones who are gonna get the message out artistically, right? And of course, having your firearms, carrying them, right? Circulating literature that is pro Mau Mau, etc. That's how you go about, you know, this shows you the parts of like rebellion. It shows you how you get folks on your side, you know, etc. Right? To continue, the most popular tunes of the Mau Mau patriotic songs were those that frequently invoke the death and name of Wayaki, and the nostalgic glories of the expropriated Africans' lands. So let's take a moment and look that up. Let's look that up real quick. So apparently Wayaki Wahinga was a chieftain who was the ruler of the South Kikiu. Wayaki signed a treaty with Frederick Lugard of the British East Africa Company. However, after becoming frustrated with the increasing number of European settlers, Wayaki burnt down Lugard's fort in 1890. Wayaki was arrested 2 years later after drawing his sword against a colonial officer, W.P. Purkis. Purkis, quote, disarmed him and delivered a blow to Wayaki's head, end of quote. Wayaki was tried for assault, convicted, and sentenced to deportation. He died on the march down to Mombasa on the Kenyan coast, apparently from injuries sustained during his altercation with Purkis. All right, so that just gives you a little background on who they're singing, you know, such songs about. Since the history of the Mau Mau movement had been marked by a greater degree of coexistence between the Mau Mau freedom fighters and the Kikiu tillers of the soil, the colonial administration decided at the height of the state of emergency to dilute this coexistence between 1953 and 1955. This was accomplished by forcing the Kikiu people to dig a trench measuring 10 to 12 feet deep by 15 to 16 feet wide around Mount Kenya in order to starve the Mau Mau freedom fighters to death and to prevent them from coming out of the forests, by destroying and burning their crops and homesteads, and finally by confining them into the crowded and filthy so-called emergency villages. You know, between 1952 and 1956, the situation was so bad that whenever the interests of the white man and those of the black man diverged, both the colonial administration and the British government chose to protect the interests of the white man at the expense of those of the black man. Are you surprised? The rightful owner of the land, right? Even though the black man is the rightful owner, they of course protected their people. admittedly, and that's what I'm talking about. When I talk about Africa as a power, right, with all of its 50 plus nations within, when I talk about it as a power, this is what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the fact that you have these Brits who are in Kenya, right, taking up the land, right? And by the way, land equals freedom. Anytime you hear talk about land, understand it means freedom, right? You have these whites, these Brits taking up the land, backed by their government that is whatever number of miles away, right? Whatever number of miles away. Let's see how far it is. Right? The distance from the UK to Kenya is like, it's several miles, right? It's several thousand miles. My point being that it's several thousand miles. My point being that the reach, Britain had enough reach to reach from where it is, the UK, right, to protect these folks. And of course they had the help of, you know, NATO and whatnot, but they were able to have that reach to go over and to help their folks on the continent. And I'm pushing for an African power, superpower, if you will, that has the reach to protect its people in the Caribbean and, you know, wherever there's African people in the world. That's what you want to have. That's what you want to have. And we see an example of it here, right? Between 52 and 56, the situation was so bad that whenever the interests of the white man and those of the black man diverged, both the colonial administration and the British government chose to protect interests of the white man at the expense of those of the black man, the rightful owner of the land. Admittedly, not only did these ill-orchestrated emergency measures and decrees exacerbate the political situation in Kenya, but they also sparked emotional responses from the victimized African communities, particularly those who were active in circles that opposed the policies of the settler regime in Kenya. Despite many setbacks in their ranks and files, lack of well-trained men, poor communication, and the unequal armed forces viewed from the perspective of their avowed commitment, the Mau Mau freedom fighters were able to engage a courageous struggle against the formidable and well-equipped British troops for 5 years. This struggle, the first of its kind in Kenya, and perhaps in East Africa, paved the way for the end of a sordid and despicable era of colonialism, and at the same time laying the ground for a new chapter in Kenya's history. In retrospect, the Mau Mau movement was possibly the most crucial resistance movement to take place in colonial Africa during the years following the Second World War. The reason, quite simply, is that it accelerated the pace of nationalism and ensured that British East Africa as a whole achieved independence much sooner than otherwise might have been the case, with additional repercussions upon the process of decolonization further south. More encouraging, while the Mau Mau movement had some weaknesses emanating from administrative discipline and inexperience in dealing with the entire masses of Kenya and in educating them politically, the movement inaugurated and carried forward the most dynamic agrarian revolution of any movement in East Africa. Not only that, the Mau Mau movement brought about the most needed changes that constituted one of the most fundamental challenges to settlers' political hegemony and economic dominance. The most devastating and perhaps irreversible political and economic defeats of the adamant and entrenched white settlers. The Mau Mau movement was not only opposed to land thievery, but also to settlers' efforts to impose their will and their economic values on Africans by a preponderance of hypocrisy and imperialist blackmail. The Mau Mau freedom fighters themselves remain united in their uncompromising opposition to the existing colonial policies, especially those affecting land rights. Unfortunately, when Jomo Kenyatta became president of Kenya, one of his first political undertakings was the elimination and crushing of political opposition, as well as the progressive elements in the country, thus stultifying, what a word, stultifying, the creative revolutionary energies of the Mau Mau movement that had been rekindled by the Mau Mau freedom fighters during Kenyatta's imprisonment and exile. Wow, okay. That's an interesting take. We got to look into Jomo Kenyatta a little bit more. Even the good intentions of the Mau Mau movement were compromised. By 1966, not only had Kenyatta succeeded in building for himself a semi-authoritarian pinnacle of power, but he had also become the favored grand old custodian and guarantor of the white settlers' economic interests in the independent Kenya. The crucial point here is that the first political group to get hold of the reins of power in independent Kenya was either disinterested in or incapable of carrying the struggle for economic independence to the projected conclusion. The group at issue here appeared retrogressively satisfied with political power, which it used to amass wealth and to repress political opposition and critics of the regime generally. Probed from any angle, the author thinks that he is absolutely right in concluding this argument by stating that the indiscriminate killing of the Mau Mau freedom fighters, innocent peasants, as well as their children by the British troops, was an act of gross irresponsibility that greatly intensified Kenya's vulnerability to political coercion by the arrogant and racist European settlers of zeal. Not only that, these barbaric killings of the innocent peoples of Kenya, regardless of whether they were guilty or not, were fundamentally and inherently racist and inhuman. What do you expect? Needless to say, national sentiments in colonial Kenya meant no more or less than the right of the peoples to determine their own destiny, starting with the control of their land-based economy. To be specific, what the peoples of Kenya were asking for, especially during the period between 1952 and 1956, was not a philanthropic charity or benevolent paternalism from Britain. They demanded that their rights to land, which had been brazenly expunged by the colonial administration, be restored and at the same time recognized. As such, the pre-colonial nationalist movements in Kenya were the ultimate outcry or protest against colonialism, forced labor, political oppression, economic racism, and social degradation, as well as all other forms of economic exploitation at the hands of imperialists, the perpetrators who vampirically gorged themselves on the flesh, blood, and bones of the sons and daughters of the soil. Contrary to the popular belief, the Mau Mau movement was not anti-European or anti-white. It was anti-oppression and anti-exploitation. I hate when they throw in those little disclaimers. Natural enough, although it appeared in 1953 that the struggle was going to be a long one, and that a period of great stress and trial lay ahead, the peoples of Kenya could not have passively waited for 999 years for the British government to come to Kenya on a humanitarian or in rescue mission in order to loosen their fetters. However, when the Mau Mau uprising freedom fighters resolutely took responsibility to free the country from the shackles of colonialism, and when the people of Kenya began to deal with political and economic issues by a more practical and revolutionary approach, they were branded rebels, radicals, militants, and terrorists. Logically and conceivably, is it wrong for one to be a rebel or to say no to oppressor? Is it wrong to question or disobey obey oppressive regime and its laws, or a reign of terror for that matter? Is it a bad thing to be a progressive revolutionary or a resistor, or to feel that if I do not hurt anyone, that I should not get hurt? Was Rosa Parks, a black woman, wrong when in 1955 she refused to stand or to give up her seat in a commuter bus in Montgomery, Alabama, so that a white man could sit? Was she wrong when she refused to move to the back of the bus where blacks were traditionally confined? Was she wrong when she refused to obey segregation law, which had for many years relegated blacks to second-class citizenship? According to Albert Camus, a rebel is a man or woman who says no, but whose refusal does not imply a renunciation. A man or woman who says yes from the moment he or she makes his or her first gesture of rebellion. In other words, a slave who has taken orders all his life suddenly decides that he cannot obey some new command. Specifically, what does a man or slave mean by saying no? Does he mean to be stubborn, dissident, or civil disobedient? In a simple language, he means that this has been going on too long. Up to this point, yes. Beyond it, no. That's what I talk about when I say you draw that line, right? Beyond it, no. You're going too far, or again, there is a limit beyond which you shall not go. Right? Here's the line. I dare you to cross it. Right? Thabo in the chat room is saying Kenyatta. He's saying what most people were thinking. Kenyatta was an Askari. Right? Isn't that what most of us were thinking? Right? If so, give me a thumbs up in the comment section of this video. Right? In other words, his no affirms the existence of a borderline. Same concept is to be found in the rebel's feeling that the other person is exaggerating, that he is exerting his authority beyond the limit where he begins to infringe on the rights of others. Thus, the movement of rebellion is found simultaneously on the categorical rejection of an intrusion that is considered intolerable, and on the confused conviction of an absolute right, which in the rebel's mind is more precisely that he has the right to. Consequently, rebellion cannot exist without the feeling that somewhere and somehow one is right. Intrinsically, in every act of rebellion, the rebel simultaneously experiences a feeling of revulsion at the infringement of his right and a complete and spontaneous loyalty to certain aspects of himself. That is to say, he implicitly brings into a play a standard of values so far from being gratuitous that he is prepared to support it, no matter what the risk. For to remain passively silent is to give the impression that one wants nothing. Right? And in certain cases, it really amounts to wanting nothing. Right? Admittedly, if the individual in fact accepts death and happens to die as a consequence of his act of rebellion, he demonstrates by doing so that he is willing to sacrifice himself for the sake of common good, which he considers more important than his own destiny. And in this light, if he prefers the risk of death to the negation of the rights that he defends, it is because he considers these rights more important himself. Even more strongly, a committed freedom fighter acts in the name of certain values which are still indeterminate, but which he feels are common to himself and to all men. Fundamentally, not only does the revolutionary love the people and life, but he also loves the world. Understandably, though, the revolutionary suffers intensely his own affliction and the affliction of all his brothers. He lives in order to destroy that affliction. In other words, though the rebel freedom fighter or revolutionary lives in a world of misery, injustice, and hatred, though he feels more keenly than anyone the misery of all humanity, he exists in order to change that world. That is to say, though he lives in an earthly hell of hatred and strife, he exists in order to transform it into an earthly paradise, a world of love. That world of love line sounds like an integrationist type thing, which I'm not down for. A world of black love is what I would say. This being the case, to be revolutionary is to love the world and the people, to love life, to be happy. Consequently, the revolutionary does not flee from life or death. He understands that it is his duty to live for the fight. The crucial point is to die for life the way the Vietnamese or Mau freedom fighter died. It's happiness to die for the death of slavery, oppression, colonialism, imperialism, and vampiric capitalism. To die for the death of hunger, misery, and ignorance is even greater happiness and honor. According to Hugo Blanco Galdo's, to die is no disgrace when it brings nearer the dawn. When you feel the massive awakening of the peasants. When you see students marching hand in hand with workers and peasants, conscious of the historic mission. Intrinsically, a fighting death is no disgrace, since for the revolutionary, that is the natural way to die. Moreover, life in the struggle is never lost. Fundamentally, since the crucial factor of any movement is its outcome, studying the aims and actions of any rebellion and its results, we shall have to say each time whether it remains faithful to its first noble promise, or if, through indolence or folly, it forgets its original purpose and plunges into a mire of tyranny or servitude. Since the factors contributing to the rise of protest, rebellion, revolution, or nationalist movements are in many cases similar, the very moment the slave refuses to obey the humiliating orders of his master, he simultaneously rejects the condition of slavery. The act of rebellion, therefore, carries him far beyond the point he had reached by simply refusing. Not only that, he exceeds the bounds that he fixed for his antagonist, and now demands to be treated as an equal. Writing on protest, resistance, and revolution, Julius Lester once wrote, quote, "To protest is to speak out against, to let it be known that you do not like a certain action of another. The protest is an action of intellectual commitment. It is to say, sir, I protest, when you are slapped in the face. To protest is to dislike the inhumanity of another. The protest is to stop inhumanity and to affirm your own humanity. Revolution is the ultimate cry of humanity that humanizes those who before were dehumanized. There is no protest if permission must be sought and rules abided by. For to resist is to say no." And that sums up my belief on a lot of what black folks do with this protesting stuff, right? I see Nikki is back tonight. Hello, Nikki. Just so y'all know, I start the show more or less around 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays, right around 8 p.m. So, that's my standard start time. And I try to keep these shows an hour and a half, 2 hours. Sometimes they do go over, but I try to keep them around an hour and a half to 2 hours long. All right, so you guys keep that in mind. But thanks for being here. I do appreciate it. By unequivocally saying no to Britain and settler regime in Kenya, the Mau Mau movement resolutely forced the British imperialists to change its policies, whose aims were to retain Kenya as a permanent settler's faith for 999 years. Ideally, the revolutionary is he who has reached that stage of psycho-social evolution, where the alleviation of his own pain is secondary to alleviating the pain of others. The point is, the revolutionary recognizes that to attempt to alleviate the pain of individuals alone is to become engaged in unending acts of frustration. But the people are economically and politically oppressed en masse, not separately. If this is true, then they can only be freed en masse, right? Just makes sense, right? I always tell people, if, you know, I use the analogy of like escaping. You know, you if you escape a bad situation, but when you escaped, your brother was left behind, your sister, or your mom or someone. Even though you may be free of it, right? And even if years pass and you're free of it and you're personally living a better life, you still aren't really free, because you cannot forget the others. It's more than just about you, right? It's about the masses, right? You can't forget all the others. I allude to this all the time when we talk about organizing and we talk about creating power bases. We have a lot of lost people, and it's easy and quick to say, well, fuck them, forget them. But will you really be able to forget them? It's still about the masses. Nikki says that I posted some books in the Discord. I appreciate that, Nikki. I'll check it out once I'm done here this evening. All right, I appreciate it. All right. Consequently, the revolution is concerned with a total change in a society's institutions. For it is institutions which change the individual. Politically, organizationally, and ideologically, the revolutionary understands that to change the institutions, he must change himself. That is to say, he and his comrades must become new men. For it is from new men that the new institutions will come, which in turn will create the new society. Admittedly, through the colonial world, the development of the economy and the advance of modern economic, political, and technological ideas eventually reach a stage when the indigenous people begin to demand and to urge far-reaching claims upon the foreign rulers. To be specific, not only do they begin to voice demands for better education and the right to participate in legislation, but they also declare that the validation of a government must be judged not by the alien rulers, but by the ruled, that the purpose of government policy must no longer be to provide comfortable lives for administrators and markets or raw materials for the so-called home country, but an increasing standard of life and greater self-realization for the native people, whose lives have hitherto been ruthlessly exploited and squandered, and are therefore literally at stake. Moreover, the awakening of critical consciousness leads the way to the expression of social discontents, precisely because these discontents are real components of an oppressive situation. According to some revisionist Kenyan social scientists, including historians, the Mau Mau movement had been militarily a failure, but this kind of argument is irrelevant for the simple reason that the Mau Mau freedom fighters were not fighting for a military victory. They were fighting for political and economic victory. However, while it is true that the Mau Mau freedom fighters did lose some battles, they never lost a war. The inescapable truth is that the movement made remarkable achievements and contributions on many aspects, which remain a historical reminiscence of its economic and political aims. Between 1952 and 1956, the Mau Mau freedom fighters delivered what later became a death blow to settlerdom and European landlordism, with the far-reaching political consequences and economic ramifications. The period from 1952 through 1956 is particularly important because it was during this period when much blood was shed by the few so that many should lead dignified life in their country. You gotta respect it. Equally important, it was a period of great realization that only by resisting and by dedicatively risking one's life, that human dignity and economic freedom are obtained or won. And that is the paper, right? This last, say, third of the paper is pure fire. This last third of the paper is pure fire, because in it, it describes to you how you must be transformed, right, to be a revolutionary leader, to be a revolutionary freedom fighter. It shows what you need, the mindset you must have, the oath, the internal oath you must have, right, to take those positions. It says that, you know, it tells you and on all of you who are listening, what you got to start thinking about going forward. How you have to think about it for yourself, how you have to pass it along to the people closest to you, you know, vis-a-vis family, friends. And if we all do it, all of us who listen, all of us who commune together, you know, in this forum or the Discord or what have you, right? The podcast network. If we all really took this advice and took heed to it and passed it along and made a culture, right? We could see ourselves being free sooner rather than later. Let's not take 999 years to see freedom. The chat room is kind of quiet. That's fine. I'm going to end here. I'm going to end here, but I want to reread this quote by Julius Lester from the 1970 writing Revolutionary Notes. He says, "Those who oppress do not respond to petitions, demonstrations, and the demands of the oppressed. The oppressor murders at his leisure and does not cease until the oppressed, recognizing that the oppressor has not right to oppress, assert their right to live by using the only language the oppressor has ever used and the only language that he understands. The sound of gunfire, the sound of dynamite, the sound of his own death in his own ears. Use that to get yourself and your people together for the future. Because what is necessary for us in the future will require everything Julius Lester just spoke about. All hail KW Don 7, who's here. He's multitasking. I know how that goes. You know, that's one of the allures for podcasts. You can do the things you need to do while taking in information, you know, behind the scenes, so to speak. I appreciate you for being here anyway, right? But that's what you have to take in. If you take in nothing else, take in that quote. If you take in anything else besides that quote, take in the character sketch, or the profile, if you will, of what it is to be a revolutionary. All right? I will be back on Saturday. We'll do Shooting the Breeze again. You guys, if you have stories or topics that you want to discuss, that you want to shoot topics to me and I talk about it from my perspective, as well as reading the comments from others and their perspectives in the chat room live with me, you know, come through on Saturday, come a little early, post your topics. I'll read them all and discuss them all live on the air. Shooting the Breeze is fun. It allows me, and I'm sure many of you, a chance to kind of bond around these topics that affect us and our community. In any event, I'll see you guys on Saturday. It's been a pleasure. Peace.
Thanks for listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast with your host, Koku. If you like what you just heard, we hope you pass along our web address, bittermedicineblogs.com, to your friends and colleagues, and share our show to all your social media. Be sure to check out our archive section on our website for previous podcasts. This has been a KWAZ radio production. Join us next time for another session of the Bitter Medicine Podcast. Follow us on Facebook at Bitter Medicine Show, Twitter, Bitter Meds, Tumblr, Bitter Meds, Instagram, Bitter Medicine.